A little bit of research, as you'd expect a research economist to do, and two things kind of stuck out from the research that I did looking at the Greens. I mean, the first really was, if you sort of think about how politics has evolved under MMP, it's quite different to how people thought it would. And the half-life for political parties, other than the big two, has been often quite brief, or else they've devolved into one-person parties. The exception to that rule, I think, is the Greens. They've been a remarkably durable and resilient brand and party. I had a look at the numbers, as you'd expect me to as an economist, and they used to poll at about 7% over a couple of elections. In the last election you got, remind me, 11?
Yep, 11.1.
And they're now running 11.1 plus or minus the usual standard error. And they're now in the polls running, depending on the poll you look at, between 12 and 14%. So you've got a brand that's resilient, it's been around for a while, it's got a strong backing, and it's got an upward trend. I was also quite impressed. I'm old enough to remember when parties were mass things and they had huge numbers of members. I don't know about other people in this room. I've only had door knocking from one party in the lead up to this election. I remember when people used to come and knock on your door. I've had door knocking from one party, which was the Greens, and I think that shows the Greens' strengths. They're not backed by a millionaire with a war chest of $2.1 million. They're backed by an active membership and a loyal supporter brand. So it's a very interesting party, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Tēnā koutou. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Derek. And thank you, all of you, for the work that Rotary does in supporting not only the Wellington community but the broader community. Rotary plays a really important role, and I think we all appreciate it. I'll try to keep my comments pretty brief so that we can have some time for questions and comments. At this election, which is now just a few weeks away, the Green Party is focused on some three key priority areas, if you like. They're about the economy. In terms of the economics, we're focused on an innovation economy, which is about investing much more in research and development, because we think that's where New Zealand's future lies, in investing much more in using our brains as a country if we want to make our way in the world. The second priority is around cleaner rivers and cleaner beaches, and so we're very focused on cleaning up our fresh water, which is now in a pretty degraded state, which is not unconnected with the economics of the dairy sector. And then the third area that we're focused on is what we've called thriving kids, which is about addressing the fact that 1 in 4 kids live in poverty, depending on how you want to define it. And we've got a very long tail of underachievement in education related to poverty, and so focused on getting a lot more children out of poverty. I'll just talk about those three areas very kind of touch on a little bit more policy in those three areas, and then I'll just crack it open. In terms of the economic frame, I talk about a smarter, greener economy, and what I mean by that is that we've basically been simplifying our export profile over a number of years. It's happened particularly over the last 6 years, but it's happened before that as well, to be fair. And so you've seen a decline in the level of elaborately transformed manufactures as a proportion of our exports, and you've seen an increase in simple commodities, so dairy powder and raw logs have become a very significant part of our export profile. Now, of course, those things have played a really important role in the New Zealand economy, but they have relatively low value add, and if we want to maintain the kind of standard of living that we want to do going forward, we need to do a lot better than doing simple commodities. And as we've seen over the last little while, both dairy milk, the price of milk powder and the price of raw logs has come down quite significantly, which is the kind of oscillation you'd expect with simple commodities. But we need to have a lot more diversified economy than that if we want to sustain the kind of standards of living that we've become accustomed to, and if we don't want to continue to slide down further. So in that area, what we're proposing is to increase the government spend in research and development quite significantly. New Zealand spends about half the OECD average in terms of research and development, and obviously part of that is the private sector underspending in R&D, but it's also the government sector underspending in R&D compared to other countries. If you look at the New Zealand R&D sector, we're probably more reliant on government spending than other countries, and that's likely to continue going forward simply because we don't have the large-scale corporations that you find in other countries that are the big spenders on R&D when you look at other countries. So we think it's critically important that we increase the spending in R&D in New Zealand. We're particularly focused on making it in the form of an R&D tax credit rather than the grant system. The current government has decided to pick winners in their approach to research and development, so they got rid of the R&D tax credit system, which basically picked the winner of innovation, and instead Stephen Joyce picks the winners that get the grants from the government. The problem with that is that the government is not all-knowing. Governments are smart, and Stephen Joyce is actually a very talented person, but there's just no way that he or the government can really figure out what is the right thing that New Zealand should be doing R&D in across the board, and it's much better to give individual businesses the freedom to do innovation and research and development, which is what a tax credit system does. It means that businesses right across the country will get some support from the taxpayer when they do research and development, and that means we underpin the New Zealand economy by adding value across the board, and I think create a much more resilient economy in the long term. In terms of the R&D grant system, we'd keep that system in place. Labor's policy is to abolish it. We think it's worth keeping, but we would give it a tilt towards sustainability, which I guess surprises no one. And so, say, one of the criteria for getting the R&D grants, which we would leave in place the same quantum, is that we would add a criteria of sustainability. But in terms of the R&D tax credits, we think it's very important that we support innovation across the New Zealand economy rather than me sitting in government and going, that one, I like that one, or even a small committee of experts saying they like that one. It's much better to give businesses the freedom to innovate. Likewise, in the science sector, investigator-led research or innovation. We think it's important to back scientists to let them follow their own path, and so we'd support the Marsden Fund, which is an open-ended investigator-led kind of fund, rather than the current government approach, which is the Science Challenges, where again the government is picking some winners and is trying to push science funding in those particular directions. We just don't think government's that smart. Governments are pretty smart, full of pretty smart people, but in terms of economic innovation, there's just no way that governments can be sure they're picking everything. In terms of our environment kind of priorities, obviously we've launched our climate tax cut, which is a policy to introduce a price on greenhouse emissions, which the OECD and every basically mainstream economist says is the cheapest and most effective way to reduce greenhouse emissions is to put a price on carbon, but then return the revenue raised in the form of tax cuts, income tax cuts, and in the form of company tax cuts. We think if you're going to put a price on carbon, which we think for the sake of our kids we really have to play our part globally in reducing greenhouse emissions, which does create the right economic signals and price signals, you should return the revenue you've raised back to those who are going to have to pay that price, which is ordinary taxpayers and ordinary businesses. So we cut the company tax rate from 28 to 27, and we'd make the first $2,000 of income tax free. The reason we're doing it like that is it's the most progressive form of income tax cut you can give, because obviously it's the same quantum of money in form of a tax cut regardless of how much you earn. So it's much more progressive than cutting the top rate. We're also focused on clean water. New Zealand has a clean water crisis, which is largely a result of dairy intensification, but agricultural intensification more generally. And so if we want to avoid, we're proposing a set of basically regulations around that to make sure that we set some basic rules around making sure that rivers are swimmable. The current government is proposing a standard whereby rivers would be wadeable. That is, if you wouldn't be able to swim in them safely, but if you walked in them, you'd only stand a 1 in 20 chance of getting seriously ill, is the proposed national minimum standard that the National Party is proposing. And I don't think that's acceptable, and so we'd be proposing a swimmability standard. So not a drinkability standard, but certainly a swimmability standard. Rivers should be safe enough to swim in, as of course they have been in the past. So we'd be doing that. And as you can see, there's a connection between our innovation policy and our environmental policy. We're saying we can't simply keep increasing the volume of milk production, which is the current government strategy. We actually need to innovate, not only in the agri-food sector, but across the economy more broadly to pay our way, rather than simply producing more and more and more milk powder with all of its tremendous environmental consequences in terms of water pollution and, of course, climate change. So we need to diversify and innovate in our economy, which then matches up with the environmental protection rules. The third area is around poverty and inequality. We have a very significant inequality and poverty problem. There's obviously a big debate about whether it's gotten worse under this government or not, but whether it's gotten worse or it hasn't, there is a fundamental inequality problem in New Zealand. And so we're quite focused on how do you give poor kids access to education. Because I don't know about you, but for my family, the way that we got out of poverty was that my father got an education. And so if you give poor kids access to education, then that is one of the best ways that you can deal with poverty. And so you've got to make sure that they've got food so that they can actually focus on their lessons. You've got to make sure they need all the things they can get when they go to school. So we've set up a school hubs policy, as we've called it, which is to deliver some basic services to kids at school, focused on decile 1 to 4 schools, so that we can make sure that poor kids get a chance to get some learning done. Because if they don't get access to education, then they're going to have disadvantage throughout their whole life, and that's bad for them. It's bad ethically, but it's bad for all taxpayers because that also has significant ongoing cost for many, many years down the track. So we're trying to address some of the issues around poverty and inequality at that basic level. So there's a lot more I could talk about, but that's the basic 3 things. We put it within a frame of we love New Zealand, as I'm sure you do as well, regardless of who you vote for. But we love New Zealand, and so we're very focused on making a much more innovative economy, trying to get away from the simplified economy, cleaning up our rivers and lakes, try to reduce our greenhouse emissions, as well as trying to pull poor kids out of poverty by focusing on education. That's the 3 key pillars that we're taking into this election. And I'm very happy to take questions or comments. So just kind of trying to address those one at a time. So I actually think dealing with education is a long-term solution, or part of it, to be fair. But in terms of the living wage or low wages, we will be releasing our policy about minimum wages in the weeks ahead, which involves increasing the minimum wage. And so we are focused on that. That's because I agree with you, that is a very significant issue, those who have full-time jobs but are struggling to pay the bills. And then there's the issue about the level of benefits and obviously some of the inequity associated with the access to the in-work tax credit, in particular under the Working for Family scheme. So we'll be releasing some more policy in there in the next few weeks. It will be done in combination with the release of our full fiscals, because we think it's very important to demonstrate not only how we're going to what we're going to spend, but also how we're going to pay for it. So after the 2008 election, we negotiated a memorandum of understanding with National, and through that we started, or rather continued, the home insulation scheme. We started a home insulation scheme under Labor and kind of got it up and running and did some of the background training, and then we expanded it significantly as part of the response to the GFC with National. We did about 240,000 houses. We also did the cycle trail. That was a joint project, as well as some non-1080 based pest control methods, these self-setting traps and stuff like that. So there's been some other projects as well. After the 2011 election, we went back to them and said, this is the areas where we think you can work in common. They said, no, thank you, but no thanks, which of course is perfectly their right. And so it kind of, to be fair, I think the relationship has become more distant since then, as we've kind of gone on diverging paths, particularly on environmental stuff, but not only environmental stuff. I think there's been a lot of gap between the Greens and National. We've said in terms of confidence and supply that we think it's highly unlikely that we could form a confidence and supply or arrangement with National because of the big policy gaps. And I think that's probably a fair thing. So I think it's highly unlikely, I think, is the long and short answer of it. And it's just because of the policy differences.
It's great that we got the cycle trail in the meantime.
Yeah.
Yuri, we've got time for your question.
Right. Dr. Norman, how do you, as a leader of the party, you are perceived as a party by the average New Zealander? Because I'm an average New Zealander and I perceive the Green Party to be a mixture of Luddites and fundamentalists who basically through
Which one am I, the Luddite or the fundamentalist?
who through preaching, I guess, doomsday approach to a lot of what you tell us about the environment, mean that if anybody stands up in opposition or wants to ask questions, they're treated almost like a heretic. So just curious, how do you think, as a leader, you're perceived?
So may I suggest to you that you're possibly not an average New Zealander? I mean, think about it. think about the vote in the election. So the Greens are supported, let's say, by 1 in 10 New Zealanders, maybe a bit more, something like that, maybe 1 in 9. And so clearly those people, they may think we are both fundamentalists and Luddites, and they like fundamentalists and Luddites, but I suspect that they don't. And so, when you look at the polls, the Greens are pretty broadly supported even by those who don't intend to vote for us. Speaking for myself, I come from a science background. My father was a mechanical engineer. I did 3.5 years of medicine when I first left school, and that's kind of where I've come from. And so, I'm very much about an evidence-based approach. I would argue that the current government is very, very far from that. I have to sit in Parliament every week when the National Party literally personally attacks a scientist that they disagree with, whether it's a climate scientist or a dolphin scientist. Most recently, the personal attack on scientists in the People's House is, I find, deeply offensive, but it is what goes on a regular basis. I don't think that they, in my opinion, they're not evidence-based. Look at climate change. So look at water quality. I think that the evidence is pretty strong around issues like climate change and water quality, and I'll stand by that evidence. And I think if you talk to the New Zealand Association of Freshwater Scientists, or pretty much most scientists, they would probably agree with the Greens about water quality issues and climate change issues in terms of the science of it. Happy to argue the science, because science isn't a religion, and you've got to be able to debate it, obviously. And every scientific hypothesis should be open to be overthrown, or it's not a scientific hypothesis. But I think that we are pretty strong on an evidence-based approach, but not everyone accepts that, and that's democracy, and that's fine.
Thank you.
Actually, I think I'll answer the question on behalf of the Speaker. I think if you had any doubt, today was a really good illustration of how it was a very good address, because he drew, I thought, quite eloquently answered the idea that the Green Party were Luddites and fundamentalists, with a very kind of thoughtful 3 key points, talking about evidence, talking about policy, talking about policy effectiveness. So I think it was a very interesting presentation. If you can join me in thanking them.
So may I suggest to you that you're possibly not an average New Zealander? Think about the vote in the election. So the Greens are supported, let's say, by 1 in 10 New Zealanders, maybe a bit more, something like that, maybe 1 in 9. And so clearly those people, they may think we are both fundamentalists and Luddites, and they like fundamentalists and Luddites, but I suspect that they don't. And so, when you look at the polls, the Greens are pretty broadly supported even by those who don't intend to vote for us. Speaking for myself, I come from a science background. My father was a mechanical engineer. I did 3.5 years of medicine when I first left school, and that's kind of where I've come from. And so, I'm very much about an evidence-based approach. I would argue that the current government is very, very far from that. I have to sit in Parliament every week when the National Party literally personally attacks a scientist that they disagree with, whether it's a climate scientist or a dolphin scientist. Most recently, the personal attack on scientists in the People's House is, I find, deeply offensive, but it is what goes on a regular basis. I don't think that they, in my opinion, they're not evidence-based. Look at climate change. So look at water quality. I think that the evidence is pretty strong around issues like climate change and water quality, and I'll stand by that evidence. And I think if you talk to the New Zealand Association of Freshwater Scientists, or pretty much most scientists, they would probably agree with the Greens about water quality issues and climate change issues in terms of the science of it. Happy to argue the science, because science isn't a religion, and you've got to be able to debate it, obviously. And every scientific hypothesis should be open to be overthrown, or it's not a scientific hypothesis. But I think that we are pretty strong on an evidence-based approach, but not everyone accepts that, and that's democracy, and that's fine.